And welcome to the February 8th meeting of the Portland City Club. I am Jim Westwood, your president-elect, standing in today for President Mary Kramer. First order of business, as usual, is the introduction of our new members, and we have quite a few today. We're always glad to see people joining City Club, and I'll introduce the members, most, if not all of whom are seated at the new members table to my left, and ask each of them to stand as I introduce them, and as usual, ask the membership to hold its applause until I've introduced all the new members. First is Carl Beckelheide, Chairman of STEP Technology. Denise Carlson, Personal Banking Officer, West One Bank. Leonard Dryden, Producer, Campbell, Galt and Newlands. Mary Jane Hewitt, Registered Nurse at the University of Oregon Health Sciences Center. Keith Kohlberg, the President of STEP Technology. Finally, Harold Waite, Owner, Multiplan Employee Benefits. Welcome all of you to the Portland City Club. We have a few announcements to make also. As many of you know, the City Club is more than just these Friday meetings. Open forums are held regularly under the auspices of the City Club standing committees, and we have a couple of important ones coming up. Next Wednesday, February 13th, an open forum titled What Businesses Need and What Schools Produce, the first in a three-part series on public education, sponsored by the Education Standing Committee of the City Club. That program will feature Marty Howard, the chair of the Portland School Board, Pete Rectanis, coordinator, Institute for Science and Mathematics at Grant High School in Portland, Kurt Myers, vice president and manager for staffing services in the Human Resources Department at U.S. Bank, and Kay Coriel, placement director of the Washington County Employment and Training Consortium. That open forum is open to the public, as all of our open forums are. It will be at noon, from noon to 1:30, next Wednesday, February 13th, in the U.S. Band Corps Tower, 111 Southwest 5th Avenue, on the 26th floor in Conference Room B. Future programs on education will be held on March 6th and April 3rd. Another open forum relevant to what we're going to hear today will be next Thursday, February 14th, titled Rebuilding the Salmon Runs. It's a follow-up to today's program. It continues the debate on salmon recovery. It's sponsored by the Energy and Environment Standing Committee of the City Club and will feature Jack Donaldson, Executive Director of the Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife Authority, Steve Smith, Branch Chief of the Fish and Wildlife Division of Bonneville Power Administration, and Nina Bell, Co-Chair of the Bi-State Lower Columbia River Water Quality Steering Committee. Oh, and also Kent Martin, who is Chairman of the Board of the Columbia River Fishermen's Protective Union. That open forum next Thursday, February 14th, will be held in the Portland Building, 1120 Southwest 5th Avenue, beginning at 11:30 a.m., going to 1:30, and again, free and open to the public. It'll be in the auditorium of the Portland Building. Next Friday, we are meeting not at the Hilton, not at the Benson. Next Friday, we meet at the Marriott Hotel, February 15th, and the topic will be 1991 Economic Forecast. Will the Gulf Crisis Hurt Oregon's Economy? Featuring Donna M. Drummond, Senior Financial Consultant at Merrill Lynch, Clayton Herring, President and Chief Executive Officer of Norris, Beggs & Simpson, and John Mitchell, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at U.S. Bancorp. Those economic experts will address questions that seem to be on everybody's minds these days. How will the Mideast crisis affect Oregon's economy? What will Oregon escape the recession, or how will Oregon escape the recession hitting the rest of the country? And where are interest rates headed? We've recently learned there is some confusion about being a guest at City Club programs. Many people think they need to be guests of a particular City Club member. Not so. To be a guest, you do not have to be accompanied by or invited by a member. You can be a guest of the club. You do need, however, to make a luncheon reservation, and if you wish to attend a City Club Friday program as a guest, you may simply call Jenny at the club office, 228-7231, by Wednesday afternoon at 5 on the week you plan to attend. We certainly look forward to having guests. That's one of the best ways that we can build membership in the City Club. Also, be sure to check your bulletin before leaving for the Friday program each week. As you know, the Benson is under renovation. Our usual meeting room is not available for a while, and during the next 4 months, nearly all the programs will be held here at the Portland Hilton, but not quite all of them. 2 Friday programs will be at other locations, such as next week's. Watch your program information mailings for announcements about these and other changes. Our board host for the program today, seated at the far end of the head table, is Lloyd Anderson, a member of the Board of Governors of the City Club, and he will have the privilege of asking the first question of our speakers after their presentations. The second question today will be asked by Jeff Carr, member of the Energy and Environment Standing Committee. Jeff will be on the floor. There will be a microphone in the center of the floor, and at the close of the presentation, we invite members of City Club to ask their questions. We open it up after the speaker's prepared remarks, and we do give preference to questions from the microphones. Written questions may be asked as time permits, and there are forms on your tables for those questions. Hold them up after the speech so staff can gather those questions and bring them up to the head table. Now for our program. 130 years ago, the Columbia River and its tributaries teemed with salmon twice a year. Salmon from Canada to Astoria and out to sea, salmon without end, to feed the 65,000 people who lived in the Pacific Northwest then, including, of course, the Indians whose fishing rights were guaranteed in perpetuity. It's different today. The Columbia and its feeder streams have been fished and dammed and tapped to the point that some people now believe that whole species are threatened. Well, but so what if Grand Coulee Dam cut off about half of the fish runs in the Columbia Basin? Has the world ended? Didn't that famous folk hero and nature lover Woody Guthrie sing about how our darkness was being turned to dawn by the power of the dams on the Columbia River? Can the Northwest expect to feed its people and to prosper economically if water that is needed for irrigation flows out to the ocean with fish runs? And is the so-called salmon crisis really that, or is it something less? Well, today the City Club is proud to present timely commentary on 3 different sides of that subject. In order to avert the specter of a listing of several salmon species as threatened or endangered, and to guarantee that there can be a revival of salmon runs in the Columbia and its tributaries, Senator Mark Hatfield and others have instigated a gathering of essentially all the interested parties to the matter with professional mediation in a so-called Salmon Summit. Some heavy sessions just this week have gone a long way toward clarifying and narrowing the issues that separate the many different interest groups. Beyond that, the mediators report that the personal integrity and the goodwill of the individual parties involved are shining forth. And I think you can see, because we have no walls built between the 3 speakers at our head table today, and they have been chatting amiably, that indeed that is the case. This keeps the dialogue on a high level, and I think it serves the public as well as the salmon runs for this to be happening. 3 of the people from that Salmon Summit will be at our podium today. In the order they will speak, first, the center of our 3 speakers is Bill Baki, Executive Director of Oregon Trout. To his left is Al Wright, Al Wright, the Executive Director of the Pacific Northwet Utilities Conference Committee. And to my far right, Ted Strong, the Executive Director of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. Each of our speakers will be allowed 10 minutes to speak. I have some flashcards that I'll hold up to show them when they're running out of time, so I hope they'll not be going over their 10. If they go under their 10, that's fine, because we can have more questions. So our first speaker, the Executive Director of Oregon Trout, Bill Baki.
We'll be adjusting this all afternoon, probably. I guess I'm your host because I kind of started this whole business when we filed the petitions under the Endangered Species Act. What I would like to do is give you a kind of context to visualize what the problem is with the salmon runs in the Columbia River, and I have a prepared statement that I'd like to go through. Protecting and restoring wild salmon is the issue. It started in 1990 when Oregon Trout, as lead petitioner, filed under the Endangered Species Act for the protection of spring, summer, and fall Chinook in the Snake River and for lower Columbia River coho salmon. I would like to believe it is no longer acceptable to degrade the productivity of the salmon ecosystem, to kill millions of juvenile and adult salmon at the main stem hydro dams. It is no longer acceptable to replace wild salmon with hatchery fish and to harvest salmon without regard for the conservation of wild runs. Stewardship is being called for, and everyone is accountable. Oregon Trout petitioned because it became apparent that after 8 years of recovery measures and spending nearly $1 billion on the salmon, we were no closer to our goal of wild salmon recovery. In fact, during that time, the Snake River coho salmon went extinct and the sockeye followed. These same Snake River Chinook populations were reviewed under the Endangered Species Act in the late 1970s, but nothing had been done for them in the interim. The region, the states, and the Columbia River Basin, with members on the Power Planning Council and their fishery management agencies, failed to confront the problem. But the problem goes well beyond fisheries management. It also includes public agencies that have authority to regulate grazing and logging and riparian areas, consumptive water use, water quality, antiquated mining practices, and farming. The competing missions of public agencies are a large part of the problem, and that problem is very difficult to resolve. In the Snake Basin during low flow years, there is not enough water to safely transport the juvenile salmon to the Columbia River and to the sea. The 4 lower Snake dams slow the current too much and act as sinks during the hot summer for the heat. This year, in 1991, it is shaping up to be like 1977, when over 95% of the juvenile salmon and steelhead moving downstream died. But this year, the salmon are less resilient than they were in 1977. 5 years of drought has hurt juvenile production, and 16 years of dam-related mortality has sucked the strength from the runs, and the fall Chinook are probably the most imperiled. But the problem of threatened wild salmon runs is not unique to the Columbia River. A national group of professional fish biologists compiled for the first time on the West Coast a status review of sea-run salmonids from California to Washington. The American Fisheries Society report documents 214 threatened populations of salmon and trout. They have identified 56 threatened populations in Oregon, on the coast, and 76 in the Columbia Basin. Over 90 populations are at high risk of extinction. We have a crisis on our hands that has been building since 1860, and we may not be able to resolve it. It's time for some conclusions. Salmon have become a contemporary symbol for Garrett Hardin's tragedy on the Commons. They have been allocated all the risks by those who have private property claims on the salmon ecosystem. We are living with the illusion that hatcheries can replace wild salmon and their ecosystem. But without the genetic information represented by wild salmon populations adapted to diverse environments, hatcheries have no future. Essentially what we're doing is that the wild salmon represent the seed corn, and we are eating that seed corn. And because we are unwilling to protect the salmon's ecosystem, I believe wild salmon have no future in Oregon. Let me finish by sharing an insight from a friend of mine. He works for the Jamestown Klallam tribe in northern Washington. The Salish people said that lower class people within the tribe were those who had lost their history. They were the families who had lost their oral history. They did not pass from one generation to the next the accumulated wisdom of the tribe about fishing and hunting, and therefore did not enjoy a high standard of living. As a biologist, my friend is convinced that we too are losing our history. The accumulated knowledge of evolutionary history contained in the genetic organization of the salmon, we are losing our history at its most fundamental level, the basis of life and productivity. If we let that resource, that history, and the benefits it provides slip away, we will become second-class citizens, and so will all future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Next, we'll hear from Al Wright, the Executive Director, Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committee.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I thought I'd start out with a little bit, just a tiny little bit of history as to what got us to where we are and why the utility industries are so active in this process. Basically, we are extremely active in this process and end up being the major shareholder in the investment in salmon because we're the ones with the concrete monoliths on the river. We can't take them down during the day and we can't camouflage them very well. So they're the one thing that stands out on the river when it comes to any other environmental issues. We've been dealing with the salmon issue since in the late 1930s when Bonneville Dam was built, up through the droughts of the 70s, the popular scientific notions during that period were you get adults past the dams and you build hatcheries to get juveniles out, and that pretty much takes care of your problems. As we went into the 70s and we experienced the droughts of the 70s and the declines of naturally produced fish, we learned that that technological philosophy was flawed. With the passage of the Regional Power Act in 1980, you heard Bill Baki say that we embarked on another and larger endeavor to enhance salmon runs on the Columbia. And between 1980 and 1990, we've spent something on the order of $1 billion, and we're spending something on the order of $200 million a year in that program. And then along comes some petitions for endangered species on the upper Snake and lower Columbia River. And now you would ask yourself, well, what happened there? If you spent all that money and we've had all these people involved, how can you possibly have an additional problem? We looked at that and said we have two choices. We can take the information that's available on those stocks and we can argue that while the stocks are declining, they're nowhere near a threatened species classification, and we can go through all the bureaucracy that's allowed to you under an endangered species law and spend a lot of time and effort and money in that debate. We chose not to do that. We chose instead to say, yep, there's a problem. Don't know if it's near a threatened or endangered level or not, and don't care. There are declining wild populations of fish, and they are basically the weaker stocks in the system. And that's basically what's got us to the problem we're in. We have concentrated our fishery management activities, the gravel-to-gravel management, whether it's the work at the dams, the interest in the harvest, the habitat production, the hatchery production, has all been what is referred to as strong stock management. We are interested in harvesting fish. We are interested in getting large numbers of fish back. And to do that as quickly and as efficiently as you can, you concentrate on the strong stocks. And we basically have been successful in the 10-year investment in many cases. In the case of the upriver Bright Fall Chinook in mid-Columbia, those populations in the 70s were declining, very low numbers and declining. Now they're substantially higher numbers and are being harvested. We're beginning to see that turnaround of the spring Chinook in the Yakima Basin, where we've concentrated a lot of our efforts. But we have by and large not concentrated our efforts in a very focused manner on these weak stocks like the upriver snakes, spring and fall Chinook. And so rather than worry about the bureaucracy, the utility industry decided to come to the table in the Salmon Summit, to come with a positive attitude, to clearly admit that we are part of the problem, and to come to the table saying we will be part of the fix. The one advantage that the listing has given us in our industry, the proposed listing, that we have never had before is the Regional Act said have the ratepayer in the Northwest pay for its share of the impact to the Columbia River fisheries based on hydroelectric development. Other fish users and river users were not included in those programs. So basically, the utility industry, on behalf of you as ratepayers, have been dealing with the salmon issue for the last 10 years, and it's been awfully lonely in the investment strategies for those fish. What this listing has given us is basically the opportunity to involve all parties who are dealing with these creatures from their from their original spawning grounds and nursery areas, down the river system, out to the ocean, back through the river system, and back to their native spawning grounds. The common term you hear is gravel-to-gravel management, and I think for the first time we've been able to get on the table all of the issues associated with that gravel-to-gravel management. So in that respect, the petitions and the Salmon Summit activities have been a benefit. Now, where does this take us from here with your money? And that basically is what has to be done is a change in the investment strategies in our Columbia River Fish and Wildlife Program, and we're going to have to disproportionately concentrate on these limited weak stocks to be able to get them up to population levels where they can survive in an environment where the rest of the stocks of the Columbia River are much larger and much stronger. So it is imperative that what comes out of the Salmon Summit as a management plan, and I am optimistic that we will get something out of that we'll be able to give to the National Marine Fisheries Service, possibly as a recovery plan, or as at least something to consider in their status review and listing process. It must concentrate on the strategy of disproportionately benefiting these weak stocks. And that's what all of this must concentrate on. The second issue that I would ask all of you to be concerned about is this entire program and this entire issue is a four-letter word. It's fish. There are interests that want to bring other concerns and other agendas to the table in the name of fish, and you should not let that happen. It is our belief that you can return these stocks to viable levels. You can do it with some efforts that are going to be painful and expensive, but they will not tear the economy apart. And the only agenda that you have signed up for as a ratepayer is to bring these stocks back to a viable level. Any other agendas should be rejected. If you do that, you will come out with a management program that can be implemented within the economy of the Northwest, not without pain, but can be implemented in the economy of the Northwest, benefit the fish, and have you maintain the other industries on the river, be it navigation, irrigation, flood control, or power production. And I guess the message I'd like to leave you with is there's only one issue, and that issue is benefiting fish. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Well, we're seeing quite a bit of light and not feeling much heat yet, and I think we're off to a good start. Our third speaker, Ted Strong, the Executive Director of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. Ted?
Good afternoon. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be invited by the City Club, an organization that I believe has very good people with very good intentions about their purpose on the face of this earth. To talk a little bit about the Indian people, whom many of your ancestors came to know as the Aboriginals that they met and eventually made war with and treated with. Our Indian people believe we were created here. We had an abundance of natural beauty, all that was necessary in the form of food and qualitative values, spiritual belonging was ours to enjoy until such time that other peoples came to this land and waged war over the land itself. And in our efforts to reach an accord that would allow our people to continue their lifestyle, treaties were signed. Vast sums of land, the Aboriginal title to Indian lands, were ceded away to the United States government. In turn, Indian people reserved very small reservations. The United States government promised that Indian people could live without interference from non-Indians forever. The United States promised that Indian people would be allowed to have complete governmental regulatory authority over its internal matters and would have the perpetual right to administer the controls over the natural resources that were so reserved in that treaty. And with this in mind, Indians relocated to their reservations. And amidst the beauty of their lands, they took up life again and were happy and content. And with that interpretation of our homeland, it also must be understood that Indian people weren't any different as a human. Culturally, we are different. Therefore, we believe that the salmon, along with all other life forms, had just as much dignity as the human was created with, that the salmon had just as much a beautiful environment in which they survived and they thrived, and they too enjoyed life. But they, like the Indian people, were interrupted. They were forced to change their lifestyle. Habitat became a word in which today it's used as restoration, implying that something had been destroyed. Literally, billions of dollars have been spent trying to restore the natural habitat, and it's a war that we've been losing. In our efforts to restore that habitat, we find that any life form must have a comfortable home in order to thrive. The salmon aren't any different, according to Indian beliefs. We enjoyed the harvest of these salmon until such time that today that harvest it's a bitter fight. And today we are harvesting a very small portion of what we enjoyed once upon a time. Our sockeye harvests, our spring Chinook, our summer Chinook are virtually non-existent, except for ceremonial and subsistence catches. Our only harvest that we have left commercially is the fall Chinook, and today that is being petitioned. It is clear to us that we won't see immediate rebuilding. We aren't going to experience the abundance in the near future that we once enjoyed. Therefore, tribes will continue to have harvest restrictions as a self-regulatory and cooperative management approach to conservation of the fish runs. Some 5 years ago, the tribes entered into an agreement also to help bring attention to the plight of these salmon. And the international agreement between Canada and the United States resulted in considerable efforts to coordinate ocean harvests of fall Chinook to minimize the impact. And today, the fall Chinook are being listed, and our efforts to improve their ability to survive, as discussions at the Salmon Summit unfortunately have concentrated primarily on water flows for the spring seasons. The fall Chinook have just as much need for water flow, and we believe that it's important to have that water whenever the fish are present in the Columbia River and its many other tributaries. We have focused our attention very diligently upon the ability to reproduce. Our integrated production plan that has been developed by our staff people incorporate some of the most proven techniques and state-of-the-art biology to try and reform the methods in which hatcheries are presently operated in order to preserve as much of the wild characteristics as is possible. Tribes have always sought as an objective to have the salmon spawning in the river. Needless to say, the development of hydroelectric activity makes it important and indeed necessary to have the assistance of technology, as technology has disrupted the natural lifestyle of the salmon. We realize that it's costly. Anything that disrupts a natural cycle, whether that cost is in qualitative values or quantitative values, it is going to be costly. But we maintain that if we truly want to see the rebuilding of the salmon runs, meaningful contributions to improve habitat, to improve production facilities, to provide adequate water flow, are going to have to be made, or we together will be responsible for the final destruction of our salmon runs. Thank you.
Thanks to each of you for very informative presentations. We'll open it up to questions now, and as is our tradition, the first question is reserved for the board host, who today is Lloyd Anderson. Lloyd?
I think I'll ask Bill the first question. What kind of objectives does Oregon Trout have in mind with reference to runs that are now extinct? Is it your aim to have those restored? And what kind of fish would you use to restore an extinct run? Hatchery fish?
Once those animals are extinct, you lose the opportunity to really restore them. You're going to have to replace them with some other form of fish. And you may find a donor stock, that's the fish that you would bring into that area, to that may be adapted enough to that habitat to actually eventually become self-sustaining, but it's very difficult to do. So once you lose those, I think that's the important part of your question, is once you lose those native populations that are adapted to those environments, you lose your opportunity to be able to rebuild those and then once again enjoy the benefits that they might provide.
I'm going to go back to the first part of the question, though, and that is, what is your objective with reference to runs that are now extinct? To have them restored?
It would be nice to be able to restore those runs.
Second question from the floor is to be asked by Jeff Carr of the Energy and Environment Standing Committee. Jeff.
Thank you. Question for any or all of the speakers. Given that the dams, irrigation, many uses of the river that came with development have been implicated as the source of our problems, how do you explain then the decline in runs that have been observed on coastal streams and rivers, relatively unaffected by development?
Well, Jeff, I might try that one. The coastal streams are highly developed, unfortunately. Logging practices being one of the primary causes of the decline for coastal salmon stocks. There's also cases where you have too low of flows because of water withdrawals even on coastal streams. So a lot of these streams were over-cleaned back in the 50s, so we don't have the structure and the habitat complexity that these species need. And so the productivity of those water sheds is much lower today than it was historically, except for maybe some of the fall Chinook runs that are primarily spawning in the lower main stem of those rivers and go out immediately to the estuary and to the ocean.
Anyone else care to give a response?
If I may address your question in a slightly different mode here, there have been patterns that have been attempted, particularly as it applies to the complete elimination of taking any fish, that we have also examined As an example, in 1964, a harvest of summer chinook was virtually eliminated. In 1977, the spring chinook harvests were virtually eliminated. And those runs haven't appreciably built up either. And those runs are left to the run of operation in the Columbia River. So examining on a case-by-case basis, I think it's important to keep in mind those efforts that have been made to try and leave the salmon free of any kind of harvest and let them be subjected to the run of the river. And we found that no increases have resulted from those efforts either.
All right, did you want to have a shot at that one?
Well, I guess the only thing that I would say is that if you compare what is happening on the Columbia to some of the coastal streams which have different forms of development on them, and some of the streams in Alaska and Canada which have very little development on them, and you see the range and variation of populations of fish, one of the things it points out is that when you set out to fix, quote unquote, a fish problem, where the animal travels hundreds of miles in fresh water and then goes out and spends a number of years in the black box ocean environment, there is no single faceted fix to that problem. It is a large environment with many unknowns, for instance in the ocean, that can mask any benefits you have. And what you have to accept going into this is the benefits from your work are going to show up very slowly, and they're going to show up over very long periods of time. There are no quick fixes to an anadromous fish problem.
Well, seeing no one standing at a microphone right now, I'll toss a quick question out, and certainly welcome questions from the floor as well. I understand that petitions have been filed for 5 species presently in the Columbia River for designation as threatened or endangered. My question to each of you is, would a listing of any or all of these species be a help or a hindrance to the development of management plans?
Want me to try that one?
You're the petitioner.
Oregon Trout has always maintained that we need to have a listing. We think they're warranted, of course, but we need to have a listing so that we can continue the discussion, because the petitions brought the people to the table to solve the problem. I think once they're listed, we will continue to try to solve that problem and hopefully cause recovery so that they can be delisted. And once again, we have strong runs that are not endangered. But mind you, we've only petitioned on 5 out of 76 potential populations that could be petitioned for.
Either of the other two of you like to comment on that?
Well, I guess all I would say is that I won't debate the issue of whether you're better off with or without a petition, because I don't think that's the issue. The issue is the recovery plan with or without a petition. And it's the most important aspect here, and Bill's pointed out, is to keep the regional interests at the table to solve the problem. With a listing, and you don't keep the regional interests at the table to solve the problem, then somebody else is assigned to solve the problem for you. And if history is any teacher, we do not get the best solution with that activity.
We have a line of questioners on the floor now.
Mary McCarthy, member. This is a question for all the panel members. With all the focus on increased river flows for migration, little has been said about improved habitat for spawning and rearing. Where does that piece of the puzzle fit?
Well, I'll try it. I'll try that one. I'm sure the others have some comments on that. We have a habitat package being worked on through the Salmon Summit. It's very controversial. It's just as controversial as the flow package. The production package also is very controversial. I have a very deep concern that we may come up with some ideas, and I think we have a good list of ideas under habitat restoration that could result in restoration of those runs. But there are special interests there as well that would like to make those suggestions more discretionary. And it's very difficult to come to a conclusion about what you need to save the salmon in terms of habitat protection, and then have special interests essentially water that whole package down. And I think that's what Al was referring to. If the agenda isn't to save the salmon, but to protect your special interests, then we should reject that.
If I might add, the measures that are being introduced for habitat restoration, we believe from the tribal community that the standards for water quality and some of the standards for logging and mining and grazing, screening of the irrigation withdrawal areas are perhaps lower than are really required. We also believe that the enforceable measurements for making certain that these measures are implemented really are not consistent with the manner in which the restoration program must be developed.
Al, did you have anything to say on that?
No, I won't enter into that.
Next question.
Steve Hendricks, member. It was my understanding that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers over the past 10 years has had money available to improve fish passage by these dams, and has simply refused to implement the money which has been allocated by Congress. And I've heard nobody discuss this as an issue. I'm curious, first of all, if my understanding is right, and second of all, what can and should be done to encourage the Army Corps of Engineers to do what must be done to improve fish passage, technically as well as simply with the water flows.
Well, the Corps isn't up here to defend themselves. I guess I'll take that one on. The issue over a number of years has been, as far as funding, and what is commonly referred to as the bypass system at the dams. And these are a set of deflection devices that move fish out of the turbine intake so they don't go through the turbine itself and up and around the dam in another manner. And that has been a controversial issue because the issue has not been that the Corps necessarily refuses to spend the money. The issue has been between the Chief's office in Washington, D.C. and the Corps out here as to whether or not there was enough biological benefit for those measures to justify the cost. And as you know, the Corps goes through traditionally, nationally, this cost-benefit analysis. And the issue out here, people were saying, is there is not an economic component. We need to protect these fish, so let's spend the money and do it. Now, these are hundreds of millions of dollars worth of devices. And we resolved that issue a couple of years ago. Senator Hatfield got involved with OMB in the Congress and convinced them that they ought to spend the money. And we got closure on what's referred to as a spill agreement out here, which is an interim fish protection program until those are built. And so that issue is, going into this program, that issue was somewhat resolved. What we find now is people are talking about wholly different approaches to fish passage in the lower Snake, which basically would change entirely the investment strategy for those devices. So and all I'm trying to point out here is the fish fix, so to speak, is a very, very dynamic procedure. And when we coming up on things 2 years ago, we'd have told you we had that solved. Going into 1991, I would tell you that's probably right back up on the table again.
And so just to follow up, what's being done on that then?
Well, basically the money's there. There's not a money issue anymore with OMB and the Congress and the Chief's office, which we had originally. Secondly, right now we're not sure we want to spend that money in a manner that was prescribed in the agreement, because now people want to change the strategy of how to use the lower Snake rivers, and it would make those devices, those hundreds of millions of dollars worth of devices, useless. So I think the status is we are looking at other strategies for fish bypass in those lower Snake River dams that's somewhat different than what was talked about as little as 2 years ago.
Any comment from either of the other speakers on that? Next question.
Carl Peterson, a member. My question is, excuse me, regarding to commercial harvesting. It seems apparent that over 100 years ago, when the annual salmon pack started to decline, that commercial harvesting has a real effect. My question is this: would international controls of salmon harvesting in the Pacific on the model of the international whaling agreements have much ability to help this fish conservation?
I would think that while it's among those things that are unknown, that certainly there is a measurable impact. Whatever that measurement might be, we have no idea yet. But I think it's apparent from the tribe's efforts to try and maintain some kind of regulation over the ocean fishery, as it's practiced by those citizens of the United States and Canada. It certainly has made a big difference for us. And I think that those areas that are subjected to large-scale ocean drift netting, which I understand Senator Hatfield will be addressing, undoubtedly has to have some favorable impact upon the ability to sustain and rebuild some of these runs.
We have a question that was handed up from the floor, and Al Wright, I'll give you first shot at this one, but the others are free to chime in as well. It says, according to Al Wright's presentation, we got into this trouble following state-of-the-art fishery techniques and using the current knowledge we had of Columbia River fish. Here comes the question. Are we smart enough now to fix this problem?
We'll never know whether we're smart enough to fix the problem or not. That's not an excuse to not try. The only way we will ever be able to measure whether we fixed the problem or not is simply by the fact that someday we hope we're going to have enough fish back in the river that people are saying there isn't a problem. I don't have a better answer for you other than we learn from our mistakes and we try to do better.
Comment I would have on that is that the salmon are telling us something very important, and they are declining, and they're telling us that they're in trouble. And if we focus on the wild salmon, which is the proper focus in this debate, they should be our indicators. They are the so-called canary in the mine, and they are telling us what needs to be done for them. Whether or not we can effectively work out our political arrangements and our intellect to cause them to thrive in the future is still in doubt. But we shouldn't lose sight of the wild salmon because it's the messenger.
Okay.
Well, certainly the technology is there. Some of the institutional bureaucracies, I think, have to be either removed or they have to find more efficient methods of operating. And we can't afford to spend inordinate amounts of time and have perhaps 20 cents of every dollar actually hit the ground in terms of actual rebuilding efforts. If we can improve some of the methods of operations by being more creative and innovate by developing strategies that are going to help the processes along, even if it means change in structure, I think that certainly the willingness is there by all the parties at the Salmon Summit.
Steve Shell, member. If the 5 species are declared endangered, what effect would each of you see on over-appropriation by farmers and cities on particular streams?
For irrigation, you mean?
Either for irrigation or city water use. How will that change what's happening in those streams?
Well, as I understand the Endangered Species Act, there's 2 critical elements. One is the concept of taking the creature itself, and that manifests itself in just about any definable form you can dream up. And if it's listed as endangered, the Act clearly says there will be no taking unless you have a categorical exclusion, and there's all kinds of bureaucracy associated with that. But the second part and critical issue in the listing is protection of the critical habitat of the species. And in the case of salmon, obviously the spawning and nursery grounds on the tributaries of the main stem Columbia for these fish is going to be defined as a critical habitat. That's non-debatable in my mind. And therefore any action that further degrades, or you have the ability to upgrade that critical habitat, is going to be affected by the recovery plan. So it would be my speculation that any stream that is classified as critical habitat for those endangered species, there is going to be no further water withdrawal from those streams. That's speculation on one person's part.
If I could add my comments, we believe that over-appropriation of water actually probably reached that point several decades ago. Water rights have always been a primary fight in the western states. The act of actually listing one of these stocks, I think, makes it obligatory upon all parties to make those meaningful contributions to the rebuilding effort. We would hope that before we got to that point, that there is indeed not only the interest, but there is the will for irrigators in Idaho and every other place, but particularly Idaho, because they are the ones who are seeking to rebuild the fall Chinook there, as well as some of the other species. We would hope that they would find the creative ways to begin contributing an equitable amount of water to sustain not only the out-migrating smolts, but also the adults that are migrating upstream to spawn in the late fall.
Ted, after you've finished speaking, here's another question that's probably for you. It makes some assumptions that you may care to dispute too, but I'll just ask the question as it's written. Why is the Intertribal Fish Commission so interested in expanding hatchery programs? Wasn't the purpose of the Salmon Summit to develop recovery of the wild salmon?
Well, first of all, the tribes had their lifestyle disrupted. We never chose or we never asked for fish hatcheries. We asked for the natural fish runs as we always enjoyed them. When the dams were built, we were told that the hatcheries would replace those runs that were being destroyed by the dams. And as a result, we became involved as co-managers of the entire fishery. Now, we are utilizing these hatcheries as a tool. We don't want to entirely supplant the wild stocks with any of these hatchery runs. We were originally opposed to hatcheries, but now, because of cooperative management, we have been asked to work side by side with all other non-Indian fisheries management agencies, and we're doing the best we can. We believe as a result of lengthy experience with these hatcheries, there's considerable room for reform of the management of these hatcheries, and that's what we're looking for, to implement a method to supplement those wild stocks that are presently in the Columbia and its tributaries.
Next question.
I'm Walt Roberts, member. My question has to do with the process that you gentlemen are engaged in, the summit, this forum, other forums, and I wonder if any or all of you would like to comment on the process that we're in to resolve a problem that is so far-reaching and impacts so many people. Do you see reason to be positive and enthusiastic about being able to come together to resolve this problem, or is this a daunting and almost impossible thing to do? Comments?
I think Al's a great speaker on that topic.
The question was what do we think of the process and its chances of success? If you look at the Columbia River management process, either from a water management point of view or a fisheries management point of view, and you track through how decisions get made and how people interrelate in those decision-making processes, you would instantly come to the conclusion that it is hopeless. Now, the fact of the matter is, from both a water management point of view and a fisheries management point of view, if we're going to turn these stocks around and guarantee their survival, we must succeed. And I believe the attitude of all the people at the table in the Salmon Summit and other people who are peripherally involved, including National Marine Fisheries Service, who are doing their status reviews and all the things they do under the law, are committed to making this work. And if it works, it will work because of the people in spite of the process.
From a tribal point of view, we find that it's been somewhat an enriching experience as well as educational. For we find that many of the participants at the Salmon Summit are learning about salmon for the first time and how salmon, their habitat, and the entire governmental structure, including the lengthy historical and legal history of Indian peoples and their stewardship toward the salmon, have come to evolve. So we find that it's been a good experience for all those who consider themselves to be an integral part of the Northwest fishing community.
I guess from my point of view, that I think I agree with Al that we're kind of hopeful people in a hopeless job. But if we are focused on maintaining the wild stocks in the Columbia River, then I think we can find a solution. But that solution hasn't had that focus before. We were primarily interested in increasing the supply of salmon for the various users of those sport fishermen, commercial fishermen, that sort of thing. We had no well-defined, and still do not have a well-defined stewardship policy with regard to those wild stocks, in terms of conservation of genetic resources of those animals. And until we decide to do that, develop that kind of regional direction, I don't think we're going to succeed. And even if we do, it's all uphill because of the process that Al was referring to.
A daunting task, but I think we have the right people here to attack it. Next question.
Marge Abbott, City Club member. There's been a lot of talk of drawing down the reservoirs on the Snake River as part of this whole question. Could one of you describe what is being proposed both for the fall and the spring, and what kinds of impacts you see on water supply, navigation, those kinds of issues?
Come on, Al, that's your baby.
It's not my idea. The proposal is, and it stems from the fact, and I think you've heard this talked about already, that no matter what you do in the upper Snake River, it is an arid watershed, and more than half of the years there just is not water available to run downstream in the spring and summer months to adequately move these fish through the lower Snake River dams, which are run-of-the-river projects. In other words, you hold these ponds up at a stable level, and you generate power, and you navigate, and you submerge your irrigation pumps and all these other things, and these fish have to move through this slack water as opposed to the environment they originally moved through, which was a free-flowing stream. So the idea is, if there's not enough water to create the proper velocities to move them through that slack water pond, let's pull the reservoirs down to elevations that we normally don't operate at, and that way reduce the cross-sectional area and increase the velocity with the same amount of water. And that makes some sense. And the assumption is that the fish will respond to that and move much faster. We haven't proven that out yet, but we hope that's the answer. And the problem you run into is when you pull these reservoirs down, you expose the irrigation pumps so you can't irrigate. You go below the outlets and inlets of the navigation locks, so you can't navigate. You go below the fish collection facilities, both adult and juvenile, so you can't pass adults and juveniles. And you get down into the inefficient operating range of the turbines, so you can't run the powerhouse. So once you get down below certain levels in the dams, you basically shut down the bulk of the operations. What we're looking at in the lower Snake is what's involved in making changes in the navigation locks and the fish ladders and the bypass facilities and the turbines and all these other things that would allow you to do that, assuming that's going to provide the biological benefits that we think it will. And that's the basic idea that you hear talked about, drawing down the lower Snake ponds. And that's, right now, all we're doing really is trying to assess what all the problems are in doing that in the next couple of years, what's involved in making the changes, how much does it cost, how quick could you do it. Those kind of considerations are what's being looked at in 91 and 92.
Would either of you like to make a very quick response? Or just out of time?
Yes, the tribal perspective is that we're interested only in getting the smolts downriver as quickly as we can. We understand that pre-dam era, the travel time for the smolt was approximately 1 week, and with the dams it's approximately 1 month. Our interest also lies in the fact that the warmed up reservoirs encourage the population explosion of predator fish and allow other diseases and so forth to become more prevalent.
With that, I'm afraid we have run out of time, and I want to say thank you very much for a most enlightening, very civil, and excellent presentation. Ted Strong, Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, Bill Baki, Oregon Trout, and Al Wright of the Northwet Utilities Conference Committee. We're adjourned.